My name is Maureen Murphy, Maureen O'Rourke Murphy, and I'm a Long Islander born here in New York. My grandparents came from Ireland on my father's side. My grandfather was Michael O'Rourke, who was born in Drumgeildra in the parish of Gortlethere in County Leitrim. My grandmother was born right across the border in County Longford in the townland of Killarthur in the parish of Ballinamuck, County Longford. My grandfather was born in 1874, my grandmother in 1878, and she came to America when she was 16. And so I was brought up in an Irish-American neighborhood, and in fact, I thought I was Irish till I went to Ireland, and that's when I realized I was American. In those days, it was a mixed neighborhood of Irish-American and Italian-American, and so we used to jump out of the trees on the Barones and fight our turf. I went to State University at Cortland. I was very lucky because from the time I was very small, I was very interested in Ireland. My grandmother lived with us, and I'd have tea with her after school. My mother was a school teacher too. And I was always interested in Irish things. And I went to State
University. Now you're growing up as a young girl, obviously very Irish parents and grandparents. How did you conceive of Ireland in those days?
My conception of Ireland, very clearly, and my image of Ireland, it's interesting because for most Irish Americans of my age, our image of Ireland was very much informed by The Quiet Man, the film The Quiet Man, John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. And I remember going, when I was a student in Ireland much later, my Irish friends sort of sneered at The Quiet Man. They thought it was terrible. Now, of course, it's had its own resurgence. In those days, there was something called the $1 Million Movie that came on every night on Channel 9. And during St. Patrick's Day week, the $1 Million Movie played The Quiet Man. And we all, as a family, sat up and watched it, and bedtime rules were suspended for that week. And we watched it sometimes at 4 in the morning and sometimes late at night. And we got so that we could even say the lines back and forth. And the music, of course, from the film were absolutely captivating for us. So that was my image. My visual image, my sense of narrative came from The Quiet Man. My sense of what Ireland must look like came from The Quiet Man. And of course, the wonderful traditional music. And we were a musical family, so we always sang Irish songs, and we played the guitar and sang. And so when the Clancy brothers started appearing in the United States in their Aran sweaters, and we would play those songs.
Did you have a view of, from whatever source, a view of Irish history at that point in your life?
Not particularly at that point. But then I went to college in upstate New York. I went to Cortland. And I was very lucky there because I had two professors who were very interested in Ireland. Robert Rhodes, who was interested in Irish literature, from whom I studied first W.B. Yeats, and Gilbert Cahill, interested in 19th century Irish history, nationalist history, political history. Not my particular subject, but they encouraged me. So when I was going through college, every chance I had to do something about Ireland, I did. And my junior year, I was deciding where I would go to graduate school. I had to teach a year first to get money to go to graduate school. But we were at an honors picnic, and I was there with Robert Rhodes and Gilbert Cahill. We were talking about would I do English or would I do history. And a sociologist, Roseanne Brooks, a wonderful character, she said, I think, she said, folklore. That's what you'll do. You'll do folklore, which is a combination of English and history, and you won't have to choose. So I thought, oh, that's an idea. And it turned out that Indiana University had a doctorate in folklore. And I got a chance to go there. I ran a residence hall and was a research assistant. So I went there, was very lucky. Again, I had tremendous amount of good fortune in my life working in Irish studies. Very early, I discovered what I wanted to look at was the relationship between oral history, narratives, legends particularly, and written. And so I went to Indiana, and Dorson was very good about encouraging me in going on with this Irish project. of the relationship between oral and written history for my dissertation. And again, I had the experience of my two mentors from Cortland, who were then involved in the beginning of something called the American Committee for Irish Studies. Later it became the American Conference for Irish Studies. And it started because these guys would go to the big academic conferences that are still held at Christmas time, and they were really cattle markets. You went and got jobs, they were hiring fairs. And they would kind of get together and they'd talk about Irish history, or they'd get together and talk about Irish literature. So they decided to start an organization called the American Committee for Irish Studies and have conferences where people from all the disciplines would come. And in my first year at Indiana, in the spring of 1964, there was a conference at the University of Illinois. I met first-rate scholars who were doing, and I realized that I really can do this. I really can do this seriously. People like John Keller from Harvard were there, the playwright Dennis Johnston, the great folklorist Maura MacNeil, who became later my mentor and a very good friend. So that really began for me to see the professionalization, or the possibility of the professionalization of Irish studies. I went and worked that summer and started my collecting. And then after my second year at Indiana, I was very lucky. I got a Fulbright fellowship to Dublin, to University College Dublin. And I decided that if I were going to use the Irish Folklore Commission archives, it was then a separate institution. Now it's part of University College Dublin.
So this was your first experience. You lived in Ireland for an extended period at that point?
Yeah, for about 15 months.
All right.
So I decided that the thing that I had to do was to learn the Irish language. And I was very lucky. I was sent to see Tomás de Walter, who was the professor of modern Irish. And he kind of looked at me like, an American woman going out to learn Irish. Oh, is she really serious? I was, and I am today, a fluent speaker of bad Irish. But it helped me with the collection. It also helped me because I didn't pass the exam, but I did First Arts Irish. And so I went to school with Irish undergraduates.
What was your physical, your view of Ireland physically? Obviously, you hadn't been there previously. You had some vague impression. What was your reaction to the parts of Ireland you have been to at this point physically?
I was in the countryside, and it was very like The Quiet Man, and very like the pictures that you'd see from the 20s and 30s.
So you weren't surprised?
I was not surprised. It was absolutely the same. And Dublin was still very much the same. The big changes came in Dublin later. The Dublin of my student days is very, very, very much what Dublin to me is always 1966. And of course 1966, 50 years ago, was the jubilee of the 1916 Rising. It was, so I was very interested in that. I knew nationalist families. I went to everything that was going on that year. It was very much De Valera's commemoration. He celebrated the lives and the executions, and the lives that ended with execution, of the 1916, the signatories of the Irish Proclamation. And he celebrated particularly the men who were executed. Some of them were signatories and some of them were the commandant, like Ned Daly, were the commandants. He was the commandant at the Four Courts. So I knew the people.
Here we can go maybe out of chronology a little. How about, since you brought up your being for the celebration of 1916 and that was 1966, how compare that to how it's being celebrated this time?
Oh, sure.
The differences.
Yeah. So in 1966, it was very much De Valera's celebration of the heroes, and the emphasis was on the heroes of 1916. As I say, the men who were executed, with the exception of himself, that is De Valera, because he was born in America. But the difference, I think, in 1966 and 2016, particularly here, but Ireland as well. Let me speak about Ireland first. In 2016, the celebration looked at ordinary people. Joe Duffy has a wonderful book about the children under 16 who were killed in 1916. They pay attention to the men, the Irish men, who fought on the Somme during the First World War. The celebration is much more inclusive. It looks at civilian casualties. It looks at other Irishmen fighting in 1916. And for us here in New York, it was a very important time for us to look at the American contribution to the Rising, the American contribution to Irish nationalism, but particularly the American contribution to the 1916 Rising. And that was chiefly through the work of the Friends of Irish Freedom, which was headed by Daniel F. Cohalan. Judge Cohalan was a state judge. And so that the Rising was largely bankrolled from here. Of the people who were shot for their part in the Rising, Pierce came to New York, James Conley lived here, Tom Clark was here, Sean McDermott was here, Pierce, of course, was here raising money for his school, De Valera was here, so that the connections back and forth were very, very strong, and of course Roger Casement. And in fact, after the Rising, the Friends of Irish Freedom were some of the people who spearheaded a campaign to try to get Casement's sentence of execution by hanging. He was hanged on the 3rd of August, commuted to life imprisonment. And indeed, it went so far as a congressional resolution from the U.S. Congress to ask that Casement's sentence be commuted. 1966 was Dublin-centered. It was more of a military commemoration. It was a march by, it was a flyover, sharpshooters on the roof, it was that sort of thing. And as I say, it was a rather triumphalist De Valera staged, whereas 2016 more inclusive. And as far as the American celebration, and we have an exhibition up at the American Irish Historical Society, it looked more at the contribution of Irish America to the Easter Rising. So if I could describe it in one or two words, I would say 2016, a much more inclusive look at the Rising, anchored in the historical past that we haven't looked at. And so I stayed in Coshawga in the beginning of the fall of 1965 and started to learn some Irish and kept it up by going to the Common Gaelic and meeting Irish-speaking families in Dublin, and that was very much my connection. I also was very friendly with the other Americans studying at the National Library. That's where we all worked at the time. And so we got together and supported each other over the years. They're friends now. They're my dear old friends of 50 years. My own research continued. I was looking at the historical written documents, the English records, the French records, and dispatches, newspaper accounts, mainly Dublin Castle documents of the Rising, and then looking at the next generations. And I went to see Roger McHugh. McHugh had been a visiting professor at Indiana, and I'd taken a course with him, so it was very nice. And I said, would you take me on? He said, well, what would you do? And I said, well, I'm doing this thing for Indiana, but I'm interested in pre-famine Ireland. I'm interested in the relationship between travelers' accounts and the fiction before the famine. So he leaned back, and he had this wonderful blue eyes, and he said, Miss O'Rourke, did you ever hear of a woman called Asenath Nicholson? And I said, no, I didn't. He said, Frank O'Connor says that she has written the best account of Ireland before the famine, and she might be worth looking into. And she wrote a book called Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger. See what you can find out about her, and I'll meet you in a week's time. So I left his office, walked down Dawson Street, and I found for a couple of shillings Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger. So I went home and read it, and I was a convert. And I worked on, this year in 2016, I finally published her biography called Compassionate Stranger, Asenath Nicholson and the Great Irish Famine. not only did she write Ireland's Welcome to the Stranger, which is what I was working on then, but she wrote Annals of the Famine about her one-woman famine relief outfit in Dublin and then out in Mayo in the worst winter of the famine, 1847, 1848. So, and one afternoon, I mentioned meeting the other Americans working at the National Library, and I went to see the wife of one of these people, and she was working in the Quaker Library, which is now the site of the Irish Film Center. And so she introduced me to her boss, Mrs. Goodbody. Mrs. Goodbody said, "Nicholson, S. Nicholson, there is," she said, "I saw a photograph of her, or drawing. It's a drawing of her. I saw a drawing of her." And I said, "Where?" And she said, "I don't know. I don't know where I saw it, but I found it years and years later. But I knew it was there, and I found it later on." So 1965 and 66, I have 3 balls in the air. I'm learning the Irish language and seeing Ireland through that lens. I'm doing my 1798 for Indiana. And I'm also discovered this fascinating American woman who walked through Ireland before the Great Irish Famine and then went back and did famine relief. So I came back to America and got married and started teaching and got very much involved then in the American Conference for Irish Studies.
So your first stay at Ireland is completed. If it's sort of a little more about your feelings and your thoughts upon leaving.
Oh,
I mean, how did you sort of summarize the impact to yourself of that first day had on you as you coming back to America?
Well, I mean, for all of us who were in Ireland in the 60s, it was a transformational year. It was we went to a different time and place. Going to Ireland today is like coming into New York. But in those days, it was a very, very different world. And I was heartbroken coming back. I mean, I was coming back, I was getting married, but I was heartbroken about leaving Ireland, and I felt I would never get back again.
Did you feel that you came back a somewhat changed person than before? Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Very much changed. I had gotten very, very serious about my work, obviously. I came back from having lived in the west of Ireland particularly. I'd hitch out and go out to spend a weekend or spend a week and do some more Irish. And living in a townland of 24 houses where there were no cars, there was one horse, the rest donkeys and carts, no water in the house. De Valera had promised water in 1932, that he was going to run the water from Spittal to Carrow but hadn't done it. And it was really, really terrible, terrible poverty. And coming back to America in the 60s, and that kind of prosperity was for me a very disjarring experience. The other thing I recognized about Ireland, 2 things. One of them was the question of immigration. When I would talk to little kids when I was learning Irish, and kids would, when they'd stop laughing, I figured I was making some progress. And so I would ask kids what they were going to do when they grew up. And they would say to me, "Be dul go America, I'm going to America." And it occurred to me, what happens to family life if 6-year-olds are saying, "Be dul go America, I'm going to America"? So that was my experience there. And as I say, would share it with, for the years when I came back, my involvement in Irish studies was with the American Conference for Irish Studies. And one of the things I did as a sort of service project was I began to look to see where Irish was taught, Irish studies, Irish history, Irish literature, Irish language, study abroad programs. And I did a booklet for the American Conference for Irish Studies, and it was called A Guide to Irish Studies in the United States. And we did about 3 or 4 issues of it. Now they try to do it online, but when I was doing it, I read through every college catalog in the country and identified people and tried to bring people into the fold. So that was very much kept me going. and then I finished my dissertation in the fall of 1969. So I came back and I worked, as I say, my concerns then were to try to find ways to work for Ireland in the United States. And the American Conference for Irish Studies was one of those things. And working for doing the Guide to Irish Studies and being in touch with people doing Irish Studies programs around the country was very, very important to me. I also started working on Lady Gregory because her papers were at the New York Public Library, and I knew I couldn't get to Ireland as often as I wanted to. And that was an important part of life. I was widowed fairly young, and so that changed the equation a bit as far as being able to spend more time in Ireland. And things began to change, to get more focused. I'd like to talk about, though, in 1967, by this time I was teaching, I had taught in the English department at Hofstra University. I became the Dean of Students for about 20 years. Then I went back to teach English secondary education. So I was in the School of Education. And one of the deans came out of the office and she said, "Have you seen this? The state education department, they want people to put in for a grant to teach the Great Irish Famine." Well, what happened is in 1996, narrow Washington Street in Albany. One side of the street is the state legislature, the other side is the Department of Education. 1996, the Department of Education decided to have a new system called Learning Standards. And for example, in English language arts, it was reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So when school administrators went up to Albany and said, "Well, what's the curriculum?" they said, "Do anything you want. But your students have to demonstrate that they can do these kinds of things to demonstrate that they have mastery in reading, writing, speaking, and listening." And of course, all the subjects had their own standards. And at the same time, across the street, we're coming into 1997, which is the 150th anniversary of the Great Irish Famine. And Anne Garvey, who was the very dynamic leader of the American Irish Teachers Association, approached one of the state legislatures, Joe Crowley, now Congressman Joe Crowley, and she asked him to propose a resolution to the state legislature to make the Great Irish Famine one of the strands of the state-required human rights curriculum. One strand was the European Holocaust, the other strand was North Atlantic slavery, and this would be the third strand. And so it was passed, and people said to, and we put in for it, Alan Singer and I put in for it, and people said to me, "Oh, well, what's the next thing going to be? The Armenians and, special pleading, special pleading." I said, "No, this is not what we're doing. We're going to use the Great Irish Famine to teach about hunger and homelessness. It's going to be bigger than this." And what we proposed was that we would do 24 lessons that would be interdisciplinary, interactive, largely project-based, use primary source materials. Actually, we did 150 lessons. And we got the grant, and we piloted it in schools all through the state. And it won the National Council for the Social Studies Project Excellence Award for 2002. And on the basis of that, Jack Irwin, who was Governor Pataki's Irish man, who was liaison with the Irish American community, Jack Irwin suggested, when Governor Pataki proposed a memorial in Battery Park City, Jack Irwin said, "Well, maybe Maureen Murphy could be helpful because she did the famine curriculum." And so they invited me in to work with the finalists. It was a public art call-outs, and I was working with the 10 finalists, one of whom was a fellow called Brian Toll, who had done an undergraduate degree in political science at Albany, so he had that sensibility, and then an MFA in art from Yale. And so we talked together, and I suggested he go to Achill Island off the coast of Mayo. And I said, there's a place called the Deserted Village. It had been occupied from about 5,000 until 1860. And there were still 74 remains of stone houses that were excavated in the 90s. And Asneth Nicholson had walked through there before the famine. And I said, have a look at those cottages. And right near it is a court cairn, a passage grave. And Brian came back very taken with a couple of things. The cliffs of Moher, which are kind of striated stone, these abandoned cottages, and then this court cairn. And out of that, at the Hunger Memorial, you see, approaching it, as you go west, you see that quarter-acre field with the abandoned cottage, a cottage from Addie, Mass, County Mayo. It's a later cottage than a famine cottage, but there was a cottage on that ground at the time of the famine. But you enter it from the west through a passage, like the passage grave. And so those, and the walls of the memorial are polished granite and then lucite. And so my job was to select the quotes for that, 110 quotes, about a mile of text. And because it's not the Irish Famine Memorial, it's the Irish Hunger Memorial, 60% of the quotes are about the Irish famine, but about 40% are about hunger in other places of the world. What is the legacy of the Great Irish Famine to the world? And one of the things we were concerned about was hunger in the world today and eradicating hunger. And one of the things that we had kids do was to make a pledge to fight world hunger, to do something. You can't, Nicholson used to say, you can't save everybody, but you can do something. What one thing can you do on behalf of hunger? So when we were coming, that was the famine curriculum. But when we were coming to the memorial, it started as the famine memorial, but I suggested, and the executive committee, I was only a consultant, I wasn't a voting member, the executive committee took aboard the suggestion that it be the Irish Hunger Memorial about world hunger, that in that respect it would have a wider, not appeal, but a wider significance to the community who have suffered hunger in other parts of the world. I think it is the preeminent memorial in North America. I wouldn't make any changes. So the difference, as I say, between the national differences between the Irish memorials, the hunger memorials or famine memorials in Ireland tend to mark the place. The ones in the United States tend to bring a message of emigration along with famine, whereas the Irish Hunger Memorial is about hunger in Ireland and world hunger.
Well, isn't there also a substantial political issue in the name that it wasn't a view that it wasn't really a famine, it was British oppression that resulted in, I mean, isn't there a strong political undercurrent that goes beyond the point you made within
Yes.
the Irish society that it shouldn't be called a famine because it really wasn't a famine. This was basically the British oppressing the Irish, not allowing food into the country.
That continues to be a contested question. But it certainly was the sins of omission, the failure to act appropriately. It was the free market economy at work on steroids. And so the failure to respond based on protecting a free market economy. And so when the matter of Hunger Memorial, Famine Memorial came up in the executive committee, it was not a contentious issue. Oh yeah, they said, essentially, yes, let's do that.
So you in effect, though, because of the prominence of the memorial, that has become sort of a factor in how that period is referenced as the hunger as opposed to the famine.
Yeah. And then the bigger question on the Hunger Memorial, and I think this is a very important question, is the question of representation versus non-representation. For the Great Irish Famine, we have a fui sceach. It's a bronze tree kind of looking like this. The Hunger Memorial is non-representational. If you go around to other hunger memorials in Dublin and around the United States, you see a lot of sculptured images of ragged people, hungry people. They're not dying of clinical starvation. because you can't do that. I remember when I was doing the Great Irish Famine curriculum for New York State, it's over 1,000 pages. New York State said they took they had no censorship at all, except in one case. They said we had a lesson on the famine today, and they said the image that you're using of a child, it's too graphic. We can't use it. So we had to find an image that was not quite so stark and graphic, which tells me that we have images that the representation of hunger is just, in some cases, just too awful to bear. And so some of the things that you see around the city, some of the things that you see in Ireland as well, are people who are hungry and ragged, but they're not dying of starvation. They're starving, but they're not dying of starvation. Nicholson describes people on all fours. Donnacha Dennehy, who has run a wonderful opera called The Hunger, coming to BAM at the end of September, describes an anecdote which led to this opera of Nicholson seeing an old man coming, and he has a child on his back, and he goes to the relieving officer to try to get a handout of meal, and he says, your name isn't on the list, you have to come back. And so Nicholson chases him and gives him money, and he comes back a few days later, the child is not there, and he is now walking on his hands. You know, he can't stand up straight. This is the clinical description of starvation. Too awful for people to deal with. It's in the opera, I mean, because you can describe it in words, but you can't put it in people's faces.
So as an Irish scholar, let me understand, the period of the famine in Ireland was from when to when?
1845 to 1852.
So was this, from your perspective, an issue of actual starvation?
Yes.
Or was it actual
Yes.
starvation?
Yeah. The images that you see, one of the big sources is the London Illustrated London News. And if you look at those images, and those are the things done by an Irishman who did the sketches, and they sort of anticipated tabloid journalism for us. If you look at those sketches, again, they're starving, they're ragged, they're hungry, but they're not clinically dying of starvation.
Well, here's my impression, non-Irish, but that I've gotten at this point, is that the reason that politically it's called the hunger rather than the famine, that it was to put it mildly, the animosity of the British leadership towards the Irish that let this happen. Or put another way, if the same kind of crop failure had happened in England, there would not have been the same results. Or do you disagree with that?
I think probably that's fair enough. They let food leave the country, and they sold short. Instead of sending out cattle and sheep, they sold lambs and calves.
But aren't you, in effect, are you saying that the British leadership knew exactly what was going to result from their policies?
They didn't interfere. They didn't interfere with the free market economy. And Trevelyan, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, thought that this was a chance to teach the Irishmen a lesson. We have three, as I mentioned, we have three Irish connections in Lower Manhattan. One is the Hunger Memorial, one is the Tenement Museum, and one is the emigration sites. I'm particularly interested in the Castle Garden, Ellis Island, number 7 State Street. Castle Garden, before 1855, people just the ships came into the East River and people got off. In 1855, New York State decided that they needed to regulate the arrival of immigrants. And they created at Ellis Island, which had been a fort. It had been, remember, Castle Garden was reached by a little wooden causeway. It's where you buy tickets to go to the Statue of Liberty now. And if you come in the door and go to the right, you'll see a small exhibition of immigration. But it was an immigration center between 1855 and 1889. And they saw about 8 million people came through. Now, meanwhile, in Ireland, Charlotte Grace O'Brien, the daughter of the young Irelander William Smith O'Brien, was concerned about immigrants going to America. In 1882, she went to America on the White Star liner, the Germanic, and she wrote a sonnet called Two Views of Steerage of the Germanic, where she contrasts the kind of cramped qualities of living in steerage with life in the Irish countryside, in the Clare Limerick countryside that she would have known. Yeah, so Charlotte Grace O'Brien comes to America, and she realizes, first her idea is there should be ocean-going nuns going back and forth looking after these girls. But she came and she lived on Washington Street up above the World Trade Center, and she realized that there was no one there at Ellis Island, at Castle Garden then, to properly meet these young girls coming in. So she went to St. Paul, to Archbishop John Ireland, the progressive bishop of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And they said, okay, they would have some reception for the girls, and they appointed a chaplain called Father John Reardon. And he bought number 7 State Street in 1884. He went to Ireland to consult his fellow priests to see how best to make girls aware of what was there. And what happened, and they hired an agent, his name was Patrick McCool, a Donegal man. And what happened at Castle Garden is if there was no one there to meet the girls, at the end of the day, they were walked across Battery Park to number 7 State Street, where they were put up for free. They could help with, they were helped getting connected with their family or friends. If they were going on to Chicago or Boston, they were helped to get their tickets and get there. And if they needed jobs, if they didn't have jobs, there was an employment bureau. They found employment for 12,000. Between 1883 and 1908, 310,000 Irish girls came through the port of New York. The mission looked after 100,000. We've digitized the records of 45,000. We have an exhibition, a permanent exhibition at 7 State Street of the girls. We have a traveling exhibition in Ireland. And I got involved because a man got in touch with me when they were setting up at the Ellis Island. They were doing the restoration Department of Interior, and they were going to have a study place. And he said, are you interested in the Irish girls who landed? And I said yes, and I started to research and discovered this mission of Our Lady of the Rosary. And then we started the Battery Heritage Foundation, which is designed to look at the mission of Our Lady of the Rosary. It's called Watson House because James Watson, 18th century merchant here, bought the house, and the pillars that you see were the columns of ships. At Ellis Island, at Old Castle Garden, Patrick McCool would walk the girls across Battery Park to 7th State Street. At Ellis Island, at 4 o'clock when Ellis Island closed, the girls who were not collected by family and friends, you see in the ship's manifests, Father Reardon, or whoever the rector was at 7th State Street. And so they were brought by the little ferry and then walked across Battery Park. But it was really in the late 80s and in the 90s I was able to devote myself back to Irish studies again. I had left my job I had the offer of a job to come over to the School of Education, teach English and secondary education, and not be a full-time administrator. So I had an academic calendar.
This is at Hofstra?
At Hofstra. My husband had died. I was on my own, so I had in the 90s particularly, and then of course from the 90s on, I was able to organize my time and my resources so I could spend more time on my Irish projects. And in that period, I did the famine curriculum, the Irish Hunger Memorial. I did the Nicholson book, edited Nicholson's 2 books. I did modern editions of her 2 books, and an edition of a very interesting collection of letters called Your Fondest Annie, of one of a girl from County Galway who emigrated to the United States, went to Philadelphia and on to Pittsburgh, where she was the children's nurse for the W.L. Mellon family. And I had her letters to the man she ultimately married and edited that. So it's really been since the mid-'80s that I've been able to devote myself to a number of Irish projects. And I'll be retiring at the end of the end of the calendar year, and I have more to do.
Are there any dream projects that you don't think you'll be able to realize, that if you had enough resources, you had the time, you had the cooperation you needed? Are there any sort of dream Irish projects that relate to your entire range of activities and the Irish community? Something that should be done, that is, as I've mentioned, a dream project that if the opportunity was there, you would still like to see done?
Yes. I would love to do a longitudinal study of women. Remember, 100,000 girls came through. We digitized the records for 45,000. I'd love to do a longitudinal study of a number of girls. They came through, they landed here. Where did they go? What happened to them? I'd love to do a longitudinal study and see what happened to girls who came through. And as I say, I'm starting with a small group, and the other thing I'm doing is, over the years, before Father Meehan, but some parish priests before Father Meehan threw out records. And so what I'd like to do is to try to reconstitute the missing records. As I say, they looked after about 100,000. We have digitized the records of 45,000. They're missing records. I'd love to try to find those, and I found a few. And when I'm not teaching full time, I plan to do that kind of thing. So those are, they're trying to find out what happened to these remarkable women.
Could you characterize the range of the experience of the Irish girls that interest you in terms as a sort of a specific subset of the Irish experience, and what their meaning is to the larger Irish experience?
I think that these girls who came to America sent the money home for their families to keep them on the farm when they were able to buy the land after the Wyndham Act. They provided that cash. They provided the cash for stock. They provided the cash for dowries. They brought people they provided the tickets to bring the next generation. So they reformed Irish America, really, through their efforts. They built Irish America. I'm an American woman who has devoted my adult life to Ireland, particularly Irish studies, Irish history, Irish literature, Irish culture. And I have the same fascination with and commitment to that interest that I had as a little girl of 9.